criticisms. Uh, One of the questions is, well, there's so many, but one of them is, could this be done again? This is one I'm increasingly hearing. Probably it could not. There's a whole series of events that coincided exactly 40 years ago that permitted this to happen. One of them was that we had a very young developer, Robert, with a bride, Daryl, and who had different skill sets, incredibly fortuitous that they had different skill sets. And Robert had already done 3 projects in Miami, always with the best architects, always by the book. And in the end, when I had met him, he said, he was famous for his projects, and he said, yes, but only the bank made any money. I worked on salary. So one of the things that guided Seaside very thoroughly was that he was both ready and he was always very tight with the purse strings. And so many of the decisions that led to the best parts of Seaside are quite simply because they cost less. And this is very much, Seaside actually is authentically like the old way of building, because there was a time when America didn't have all the money to throw around. And the less money we had, the smarter we were. And our towns were smarter. And actually what I've traced all my life is that as we have more money thrown at the developers, they literally force us to do stupid things, to build too quickly. And that is in itself something that can be tracked. I understand that Chris Lineberger has written a paper on this, how the amount of the whole aspect of the large loan distorts the kind of small scale urbanism which is represented here. Also the successional urbanism that is done over time. Time gets eliminated because returns have to be very fast. The second thing, which is astonishing, is that when 40 years ago, there was no bureaucracy in this part of Florida, just none. There was no one when we did a plan, we said, who do we show it to? And there's a myth, I don't know whether it's true, that Robert actually had to create the planning department, the Phoenix Springs, to get a stamp, to get a loan, which of course that proliferated into a monster that no longer gives permits for anything remotely like this. Okay, but at the time, if somebody had come against us and questioned anything we had done, from the drainage to the streets to the setbacks or anything, we did not have the equipment to give answers, to fight back. We would have been crushed. If there had been the least bureaucracy the way there is now, we would have been crushed. And so that was an incredibly fortuitous time. And one of the reasons that we have to continually educate developers is not so much in doing it in a straightforward way, but how to bypass, how to hack the system that systematically forbids this, everything that you're seeing here. You know, what's the explanation that you gave? Chuck just gave quite a few. How do you explain to an engineer how to design a road that looks like this? We couldn't have done it. The Seaside couldn't have been. The other thing that's I think interesting is that because we're all very inexperienced in conventional suburbia, you know, the stuff that had the great collector streets with the cul-de-sacs and the separate shopping centers and the separate office parks and so forth. We were so ignorant because, of course, education then was as unrealistic as it is now. We were so ignorant that we didn't know how to do this, the standard suburbia. And something I've found since is that the standard suburban pattern has its own reptilian intelligence. It is not completely, free of thinking. There's an internally supportive system in which the thoroughfares that you don't like and the separation of functions and the way the parking is calculated, the first thing we have to grant the existing system is that from top to bottom, it integrates perfectly and it makes sense within its own system. And actually the hybrids have a very hard time working, because you can't just say, well, we'll do this but not that. We'll do this but eliminate the parking, or we'll do this but not have setbacks. They're incredibly incompatible. It's as if when we showed up here, it's as if Mars had been discovered and it was life not based on carbon but on ammonia. You know, it's just two totally different systems of life. And nothing that we do, no document that we write, not even the new book you're going to write, should eliminate the existing system. You cannot extirpate it. It continues to exist. All we have ever wanted to do is to set up a level playing field where it is not more difficult to do this than conventional suburbia. That's all we want. Just level the playing field and the market will decide to an extraordinary extent that they prefer this. rather than conventional suburbia. But what happens is that it's so damn hard to build this. It takes literally heroic developers, heroes, fans of Sisyphus, to actually, the saints of Sisyphus should be actually to actually attempt to do something like this, because the opposition, the field is so unlevel. So that there was also one other thing that both Liz and I and Robert, we had all experienced wonderful places. Robert, Boston, Liz, Philadelphia. I grew up in Barcelona. And we all missed that. We missed it. And so we would gravitate to the Key West, we would gravitate to the Nantuckets, we'd gravitate to the Charlestons. And since we knew nothing, we actually took the measurements, literally empirical measurements. We'd say, oh, that's a nice street, let's measure it. Okay, we didn't even know that the public right-of-way was different from the private lot. We didn't even know that. So we went ahead and measured not only the movement pavement, but the sidewalk, the trees, the setback, the porch, and the seat. We didn't know where to stop. We didn't know that actually the street right-of-way was a specialty, and that everything that happened on the private lot was another specialty. So we always measured in an integrated way. To us, it was just one thing, wasn't it? The whole frontage was one thing. And I think if we'd had any training whatsoever, bless you, Yale, for teaching me nothing. If we had actually known something, we would have stopped at the right-of-way and shoved it to him, and then we would have shoved the other thing to our cases, but we didn't. And all our drawings were always measuring. And it was always this kind of untainted human. And again, I have to say, I'm so grateful for the complete collapse of architectural education in the 70s, that actually we had no bias against what we were seeing. And so everything was just empirical, this incredible, almost like vernacular mind. This is how the peasants authentically did it. It wasn't the way most architects have to do now, is actually recover. Just like you're a recovering engineer, our architects have to recover from their education before they actually see things in simple, clear ways. So that time was really, really important, that coincidence that this would happen. Now, people say, well, Robert just inherited the land. That was so easy. No, he had to pay off cousins and, everybody else. What he had was patient money. What he had was actually patient money. But people had to be paid, just like a completely normal place. This wasn't Santa Claus. And that patient money allowed all sorts of things which are no longer, or difficult, which is that real estate is not about selling widgets as fast as possible. It's about appreciation. And what Robert taught me, and my father, who was a developer, also helped him, is say the real play in real estate is appreciation. It isn't selling fast. Okay, if you want to sell fast, invent something and sell it fast. It's a lot easier. What you do is you control the appreciation, which, by the way, people say, well, that's disgusting, appreciation. Well, you know what? What Robert was doing is creating wealth for every buyer, because this was built, there were virtually no loans here, virtually no loans, because this was built sequentially from the investors. The investors are the buyers, and they got terrific returns. Okay, there was a feeling that the people who came early and bought that house, that we owed them something, that we owed them a return. And this is something that has completely, actually, the return now goes, we keep score differently. But I still feel very strongly that those who trust places like this and buy early actually deserve to be richly rewarded. And the fact that actually appreciation was all in our mind the entire time. And I know that Robert and Daryl did everything that they knew to appreciate the place, to make the retail a certain kind of thing, to never lower the price regardless of the recession. Never. You bring the sales down to nothing if necessary. Maybe you sell nothing, but you never lower the price, because that's a betrayal to your investors. And I learned that here. And I don't know where Robert learned it, but it just seems so logical. It's particularly, I think, because we knew the people. Robert knew the people who bought here. The sales of the early lots were done at the dining room table with Robert cooking the best spaghetti in the entire panhandle, which of course was not very competitive at the time. The upgrade was actually fried mullet under a neon light, frankly. I'm not making this up. And so The other thing that happened that was really fortunate, because Robert was young and he had a bride, and then he had a child, Seaside, in the very best way, became autobiographical. For example, the first thing he needed was good company, because this was absolutely vacuous. There was nothing happening here. And he realized that actually some of the best company and the least expensive company in the world were architects. And so if he hired interesting architects, he could persuade them to hang around for a long time for purposes of amusement. And that's one of the reasons that we had so many interesting buildings, because it could have been done just by builders, etc. But architects are interesting people, and a lot of them are here. And they had to be young, because they had to be on a very small burn rate to actually put up with amusing Robert for 3 or 4 months. But the fact is that it brought very interesting young architects and made them. By the way, Steve Hall's first building is here. I think he'd built some kitchen cabinets, when we hired him. And all of them, there's a dozen. I mean, Deborah Burke's first few buildings were here. I don't know. We know this. He's the dean at Yale now. Steve Hall is one of the most famous architects in the world at the moment, if not the most famous. His first buildings were here. Machado Silvetti's first large building was here. I mean, we really had a good eye for the talent, and they had the time. We gave them the opportunity to do that, but it was completely symbiotic because it got a lot of press. These buildings were all famous. But at the same time, there were a lot of regular people building houses with no degrees at all, just sheer old vernacular talent. I know there was a lumber executive who designed his own house, one of the best of them all. There was a woman, I don't know what her skill set was, but she designed and developed 5 houses. Very nice. So we did not select always the architects. What happened is people were allowed to build for themselves. And this brings up an important issue. Most new urbanist projects are actually, in my opinion, not urbanism at all. They're very large architectural projects because they're done by a single firm. Okay? Now, the architecture is fantastic, and by the way, I can name the great firms, Torre Gallas, LRK. They do the plan, then they do all the buildings. But the variety is never authentic. You cannot have the same person design 6 houses in a row and pretend that they have authentic variety. They're false variety. And I think one of the things that people don't understand, they said, well, why do you get so much press at Seaside? You get published, every 2 months there's a house published, and it's because Duany speaks so well. Okay, yeah, I'm well, but I'm also very obnoxious. Okay, there's lots of reasons to avoid me. But what actually happens is that the architecture is genuinely interesting because 40 to 50 designers are constantly working on this. Well, everybody else, of course, is lovely, the Torre Gallas projects. They're lovely. I love writing the introduction to their book. Okay, but it's all excellent. It's all the same level of excellence. And what happens here is we decided very early on to write a code that permitted people to act organically and sequentially. For me, urbanism is not size or complexity, because architecture can be very large and very complex. Urbanism is the incorporation of many decision makers sequentially, which is what happens when over time you invite a lot of people to have a say. And by the way, keep the standards relatively low, because if not, you end up in a place so perfumed that eventually you have to leave. I mean, a place that doesn't leave you alone to have lunch quietly without admiring the architecture. In Seaside, we came up with a code, the first form-based code was here, and we did it in some ways because we didn't know better. It was a lot easier to write a code that's form-based instead of a legalistic code. But what it did is, because we set the standards wide, what happens in Seaside, what happens when you write a code and you try to eliminate the bad stuff, the kitsch, you inadvertently eliminate the masterpiece as well. You can't, right? It's like a sine curve. You eliminate the ridiculous looking, polyzoidal window, and you eliminate, half the hotshot architects in the world right there. Okay, so we happen to have written a relatively loose code, and what you find in Seaside is both the worst buildings of the new urbanism. By the way, that's by my highly educated opinion. Some people think they're the best. Okay, some of the worst buildings in the new urbanism, and clearly the best. Okay, what happens to Seaside is it oscillates up and down. The people who hate Seaside photograph the kitsch and say, look, complete garbage. Okay, the people that love Seaside actually photograph some of the most interesting buildings in all the new urbanism because of that sine wave. What happened to Disney, to Celebration? Celebration was so afraid of kitsch, because Disney was involved, that they wrote a very, very tight code they called the pattern book, which eliminated the bottom and inadvertently also sterilized the top. And so when you walk around Celebration, you do get the feeling that it's awfully nice. They said, well, I've walked 2 blocks, now can we have lunch? Okay, while at Seaside, the more, if you take the time to walk and look at the buildings, it is continually fascinating because they really are different. They built in a lot of care. That was incredible luck. The other thing that happened, which was incredible luck, was that developers would come and find out, because I don't know why this place, the world was so ready for this place, that people began just coming all the time, very early. And developers were saying, Robert, Daryl, tell us, like, how'd you do the retail? How'd you do this? How did you, what's going on? And Robert and Daryl at the time had enough time in their hands to give a great deal of attention to each developer coming to ask questions. And then at one point, it just became overwhelming. And so the Institute was founded. The Institute, this Institute that we're here doing now, was institutionalized to invite people who actually were interested in new urbanism and expose them to the new expertise that had been developed. You know, the traffic engineers, the marketing people, et cetera. All that actually then became gradually institutionalized, just to answer the questions that were bedeviling Robert and Daryl. You know, they couldn't handle it anymore. And then this grew and grew and grew and became, I mean, we had conferences 3 or 4 times a year that lasted, 3, 4, 5 days, and we decanted them to the ULI, and we decanted them everywhere. And eventually we discovered that other people had arrived at the same thing, Steph Elizoides, Peter Calthorpe, Liz Moule, Dan Solomon. We discovered UDA, that there were other people on it, and we decided to join forces to learn from each other. And so, but it was essentially decanted from the Institute, this Institute. And it decanted, became the CNU. And one of the things that's happening now is once the CNU takes care of it, Seaside Institute has to take on additional, new challenges that can be solved at the level of urbanism. Okay, so what you're seeing is a unique situation. Now, the greatest criticism that we have received is it's only a resort, right? Well, I love resorts. There's one down the street called, designed 10 years later, called Rosemary Beach, and another one called Alice Beach that was 10 years after that. And each one is a quote unquote correction of the prior one. And the 3 of them, I mean, if Seaside is interesting, and Rosemary is interesting, Alice is interesting, each one is a correction of the prior one. When you look at the set of 3, including, by the way, Watercolor, which is in some ways the spawn of Seaside and better in many ways. That was Jack Robertson. A lot of fabulous architects were involved and planners. When you look at that, you have here in Florida, 3,000 of the best buildings in the United States built in the second half of the 15th century in little old Florida Panhandle. Okay, right here. If you want to learn about architecture, the concentration is astonishing here. And we need to talk about how that happened, because at the beginning, people built very badly. Like, I used to give a tour of early and late Seaside and point to disasters of carpentry. And we'd all laugh, like, this guy couldn't nail something, he didn't have a level, And then sometimes the old, incredibly lousy building would be right next to some 10 years later, and the contrast was like what Rome must have been between the Visigoths and the Renaissance. They still had the old, like, mud hut and, the Palladio. And that's what it was like. Now, all those early buildings are gone. I can't give that tour anymore because they all got demolished, the early ones. But what Robert and Daryl did is they slowly, painfully created a craft tradition in which people realized, the carpenters everybody, that if they did things right, they would be paid more. And you can't do that immediately. Like, take 3 times as long to do it and you'll get paid 3 times as much. No, that's not the way it works. You do it slightly better and you'll make a little more money. And then you do it slightly better. And what was created here is a level of craft absolutely unequaled in America. Okay? And it's good at Seaside, it's better at Rosemary, and it is completely off the charts in Alice. What they're building in Alice, if you get inside those houses, there's nowhere in the world in which the craft is better than Alice. And that was actually built a little bit by a little bit by a little bit, from bad sheetrock to the most, I always say, and grant you, I'm not exaggerating, Alice, you want to lick the walls. It's like, oh, I want to lick that. It's so smooth. It is so perfectly. It's fantastic. At Seaside, you still can get a splinter if you touch things, okay? So there's that range. And so all these things are really as it should be. Everything was sequential, everything was built slowly, the tradition was done. Now, at the same time, the greatest criticism that we've received is that this is a resort. The reason I like resorts is that they're experimental. Okay, resorts are the laboratories of urbanism, because we've done plenty of full-time communities. There's a huge one in Washington that couldn't be better, really, Kentlands, but it's normal. It's 24-hour living. It's regular people. Americans want to go to a better place when they vacation. They don't want to leave New Jersey and arrive in New Jersey. Okay, it just isn't worth it. Okay, so what happens is you come here and they want a measure of utopia. That's what they want. And so it frees people to experiment much more. Now, the early experiments were, what about an outdoor shower? Or what about a porch you can actually sit in? Those are radical experiments. And then what about a tower? And what about this? And what about mixed use? Which we couldn't have done in the full-time community. Or what about parking being inconvenient? Specifically inconvenient. What about parking being undersupplied? All these things that you can't do in a full-time community, not immediately. Well, Seaside, being a resort, had to do that. Resorts always have to be better. And that's why the old traditional resorts like Nantucket and Key West and Charleston, they have to be better. You don't leave Plainfield, New Jersey to arrive Plainfield, New Jersey. You have to go, you have to go to a better place. So resorts are perfect if they're used as experimental platforms. The second thing about Seaside, and they say, yeah, but nobody lives here full time. Well, many people did. Some people do, many people did. At some point, the rents got so high, it was irrational to actually not rent your house. It just, it's too self-indulgent to not rent my house. It's just too profitable. That brings up two things. First of all, that there's nothing dishonorable about the amount of wealth that was created at Seaside and distributed. Okay, many people who work here actually are much better paid than they would have been. The carpenters are better paid, the subs are better paid, people are actually better paid. You have carpenters that have Cadillacs. Okay, try that somewhere else. Okay, and the reason is that people, that money, the amount of money that is made here and distributed is an attribute of urbanism. America was pioneered by 30 million penniless immigrants, okay, in the latter half of the 19th century. And one generation later, they were building opera houses and becoming wealthy. Like, urbanism creates wealth in a distributed way. What doesn't do that is the developer that takes it home to the investors. And so the fact that so many people actually have done very well, and by the way, this is independent of the 200 jobs that very early on were permanent jobs here. I mean, I remember I asked Robert 20 years ago, how many people have jobs at Seaside? 200. Between the school teacher and this and all these people doing things, 200 permanent jobs. And they said, well, it's not mixed use. You want more than 200 jobs? Like, what are you talking about? You see? And so that aspect, but the best aspect of being a resort is that urbanism cannot be visited and understood. You can't show up and say, I love it or I don't love it. You can do that for architecture. But urbanism, you have to live. You have to live one day and another day, and it slowly dawns on you that your experience at breakfast and the freedom your child has and the martini at midnight and all of these things and all the things that happen from the first hour to the last have to be lived. Urbanism has to be lived. The amount of writing, which is completely ridiculous in Seaside, I can immediately tell that they've never been there. The stupider it is, the more I realize, and it is impossible to come here, to actually be here and say what they say, and it's impossible to live here and say what they say, okay? Because I've experienced it many times. People say, oh, I had no idea. I had no idea. And the first thing is when they say Seaside is too neat, I understand you've never been there. Seaside is very close to being a slum. Perhaps not at the moment. But if you stay 1 week, you will see it's full of elbow holes everywhere, and it allows you to breathe. But the fact that you can rent a house, which you can't do, let's say in Kentlands, that you can rent a house for a week and actually experience it as urbanism should be experienced, has made it an incredible propaganda vehicle. It's not just the books that have been written by people who came to Seaside. It's the 100,000 people that have experienced urbanism and went home and asked for it and understood it because they were able to live urbanism. And it's very rare to do that in America, to actually live it. And that's what Seaside has provided. We could not have chosen it. Of course we want it to be a resort. The resort have allowed 100,000 people to live urbanism that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so the fact that it's a resort is also incredible luck. It was meant to be a full-time community, but it's a resort, and that's all for the better. Okay, so those are the things that are not physically here. One last thing, when you look at this doesn't look that abnormal now. We have native species. We have xeriscape, very little lawn. The rooftops shine the sun off. Those zinc roofs, they're excellent for lead. There are porches for shadow and all that. Virtually every decision that in retrospect has turned out to be environmental, the way the drainage is handled, the way is because it was less expensive. I wrote an essay about this. We were not actually trying to do the right thing. We were trying to do the least expensive thing. And so I'm completely astounded at the extent to which modern green building and modern green urbanism has to make the case, oh, this costs more, but don't worry, it'll pay for itself in 8 or 10 or 18 years. And even worse, do the green thing because it's the right thing to do. I mean, we don't have enough Presbyterians in this country, okay, you might try it in Canada, but it ain't, or North Europe, but it ain't gonna work here, okay? You cannot say do the right thing. It's got very little capture. But we did it because it was less expensive. And I think there has not enough argument has been made, or at least it's not well known. The people here know very well what it is. Not enough of an argument, a thorough argument has been made that this original green, and I'm referring to a book by Steve Mouzon, the original green, okay, may not perform to LEED standards, but only because it's a totally different system. And that if we were to present this to developers, if they were allowed to do drainage the way we did drainage and to landscape the way we did landscaping and to use this pavement and to have the setbacks we do and to elevate the buildings and to not have everything be handicap accessible, not quite everything, I think that environmentalism would spread much more widely, because the idea that it costs more is something that it's a huge impediment. And this is an example, I think probably the most interesting example of this is that it's actually an example of low-tech environmentalism. And one of the things, we're working on a book that, by the way, it's not just Seaside that did that, because the DNA was picked up by watercolor by Rosemary and Alice. The DNA has spread and become ever more embedded. And our engineers here know how to calculate drainage without pipes. Okay, and they know, they can actually say that, well, brick works a certain way. And arguments are made that allow all sorts of things. We do get DNA here. Seaside has allowed the original green to expand well beyond the borders. Now, as we walk, you can give yourself a tour because nobody's going to hang close enough for me to hear it. But just please approach me if you have any further questions. But I think all the important things that make Seaside special were just fortuitous. And it was meant to happen. I mean, everybody was ready for it. So it was just the right time.